Good afternoon or good evening. I'm Keith Luce with NCNK. It's our privilege today to host Jonathan Cheng, the China Bureau Chief for the Wall Street Journal, overseeing the coverage of the world's second largest economy. He oversees a team of more than 24 correspondents and researchers in Beijing, Shanghai, Hong Kong, and so on. He also previously served as the sole bureau chief for the journal. And Jonathan, we welcome you back. It was 9 years ago that you spoke at a policy salon hosted by NCNK and the Mansfield Foundation. So thank you for doing that. And we're really pleased to have you back here at this time. So Jonathan is here today to talk about the implications of the Kim family personality cult and how Kim Il-sung's selective application of certain Christian rituals and doctrines came to shape contemporary North Korean society. And I will be referencing throughout Jonathan's book, Korean Messiah. I would say this if Jonathan were not sitting here, but this book should be required reading for any American official, any American at all that will be interacting with North Korea in the future. It is a very rich overview, not only of Kim Il-sung, his political approaches, et cetera, but it provides an in-depth background of how he was thinking, how he processed, how he, in fact, engineered his survivability within the DPRK throughout the years. But let me stop there for a moment. Jonathan, tell us, why did you do this? This is a 12-year project. That reflects a certain level of passion on your part?
Obsession. One
Obsession.
could say, yes,
All right.
obsession.
Obsession.
Yeah, no, it's first of all, thank you for having me here. And it's great to be with NCNK. Been getting all of your invitations and all the work that you've been doing all these years. I know I'm not actively engaged on the North Korea front. I'm in Beijing. I have been since 2019. So the last 7 years I've really been focused primarily on the PRC. But as I always say, once North Korea gets its hooks into you, it never really lets you go. And so this project, of course, it does date from that time that I was in South Korea and thinking primarily about North Korea and the work that you do and the audience that we have. I was looking at the list of attendees, a lot of familiar names and a lot of friends. And this is, of course, I've done several book talks over the last few weeks, but none as focused on North Korea as NCNK. And so I hope that we can take the discussion today perhaps in a more specialist direction. I don't know that we need to necessarily go in that direction, but we can because we have a lot of people here who have been in the country, who have spent time there and interacted with North Korean officials and all the rest of it. So it's a real privilege to be here. To answer the question, how did this begin? Well, it begins, I don't know if he's on this webinar. I believe he is, but Tony Namkung is almost, I don't know if I go too far in saying it, but a real mentor to me, almost generationally, almost like a father figure to me. And really it begins with him because when I was first sent to South Korea in 2013 to take up this post at the Wall Street Journal, I didn't know all that much about Korea. I'd certainly never lived in either Korea before. I had studied Korean for a few years by that point, but by no means was I an expert. I should just make clear that I'm ethnically Chinese. My parents are from Hong Kong, so I'm not. I didn't grow up speaking Korean at home, and in fact, I didn't have too many Korean friends until I got to college when I started to engage and interact a lot more with of course South Koreans or Korean Americans. But it was really this 2013 experience when I was sent to the country that I just really wanted to try and understand everything I could about North Korea. And I met Tony Namkung quite early on in that process. I was still based in New York for the Wall Street Journal at the time, and he was and is living in New Jersey. And so I wanted to reach out. Tony was, I think many people here will know, was engaged in a lot of track two diplomacy helping some pretty big name figures get to Pyongyang, including Eric Schmidt of Google, I believe Bill Clinton as well. Um, and I think there was a lot of interest just as a news person in meeting somebody who was helping to facilitate some of this. Keep in mind, I didn't really know all that much about North Korea at the time. And so the other thing I did was I spent a lot of time reading about North Korea, picking up sort of the classics, the Oberdorfers, the Bradley Martin, Barbara Demick, the sort of books that one could get in a proverbial Barnes and Noble. And I started with those books, and so many of them would say the same thing. They would say Kim Il-sung was born April 15th, 1912, on the outskirts of Pyongyang. The book might mention that he was raised in a Presbyterian family. The book might mention that Pyongyang was so Christianized it was known as the Jerusalem of the East. And I would read lines like this. I was raised in the church back in Toronto, where I grew up, in a Chinese immigrant church. And I was intrigued by this. And I thought to myself, there must be something here. And so when I made my first trip to North Korea in 2013, I was overwhelmed by what I regarded as the religiosity of the country. I know I'm not the only one to have felt that, but certainly perhaps because of my upbringing, I was more attuned to it, perhaps. And I just wanted to find out what the connection was between the Jerusalem of the East, between Kim Il-sung's upbringing and the state that we have today. And Tony, his grandfather was one of the first, I believe the first Korean to be a professor at the Presbyterian Theological Seminary in Pyongyang at the time. And so as Tony made his journeys from New Jersey to Seoul, where I was, to Beijing, and then to Pyongyang and back, we would sit down for these long lunches and we would just talk not just about what was happening in the news with North Korea, because again, as a newsman, as a track two practitioner, we were, of course, obsessed and deeply engaged with the North Korea of today. But what was so interesting about Tony and I was that we couldn't stop talking about the past. I studied history as an undergraduate. I wrote my senior thesis about Korea in the 1890s. Tony was an academic before he entered the world of track two diplomacy. And so both of us were just so drawn. And after a certain time, Tony said, you need to write a book on this. Because I just started doing a little bit of reading, a little bit of research. I thought perhaps this might be a piece that I might write for the Wall Street Journal that says, dear reader, you know about North Korea today. You may have sensed a tinge of religiosity in the country. Did you know that Kim Il-sung was raised in the city known as the Jerusalem of the East to devout Presbyterian parents? And I thought that would be it, maybe 2,000 words, weekend read in the Wall Street Journal. But instead, through the coaxing of Tony and through just a lot of reading, I was able to eventually find enough interest in having a book publisher take this on. And I am grateful to the publisher, Alfred A. Knopf, because they really believed in this and let me go quite long. And they encouraged me to go long. They told me that you've got a panoramic story here, John. You need to go widescreen on this book. And
Interesting.
And well, that's what I've done. This is 768 pages. It's a tome. It's a tome.
Well, it's a difficult book to sit down once you begin reading it, because there are a number of stories, reflections, quotes that could lead you into other directions, all to be investigated. Well, perhaps you can be an encouragement to Tony as he does his own writing
Yes.
based on his knowledge. So in terms of the Kim Il-sung personality, his approach to leadership, as you point out in the book, that as a young guerrilla fighter in Manchuria, Kim Il-sung understood the power of storytelling and mythology. In your mind, to what degree, or actually compare that approach to that of Kim Jong-un today. Does Kim Jong-un today employ those same approaches, modified, or what would you say?
I think Kim Jong-un does. He is his grandfather's grandson. He very much understands the vocabulary, and I don't mean just the words, but the vocabulary of power, of narrative, of storytelling, of faith in a certain sense. I wouldn't suggest, because I don't have the evidence for it, that Kim Jong-un was raised in a Christian environment. I doubt it. Um, but Kim Il-sung, I think, was raised in this, not just the Christian tradition and the rich storytelling that comes out of that, but also even just the folk tales of the Korean nationalist resistance to Japanese rule that you saw in the 1910s, 20s, and 30s. This mythology of a Kim Il-sung figure. That was not his birth name, of course, and he adopted that name in part because of its legendary overtones that it already had. But ultimately, I think he understood, and this is one of my favorite moments in the book, and I think you may be referencing that, where um, he has some of the simple peasants that he encounters in Manchuria who start to believe these almost mythical, magical things about him. And as Kim Il-sung himself tells this tale in With the Century, his 8-volume memoir, um, he was wondering why why would we let these simple peasants believe these myths about me? And at a certain point, you can see almost the light bulb go off in his head where he realizes, the Korean people have suffered, they're oppressed under Japanese rule. They need someone to believe in. If I'm going to be that person that they need to believe in, then who am I to say no to that? Who am I to dispel these myths? If they want to believe it, they should believe it. I can be that person. And so that is, in a sense, what he does.
All right. It's to me, it's fascinating to consider the differences in North Korea under Kim Il-sung at that time and the North Korea of today. And North Korea under Kim Il-sung, which was totally or near totally cut off. During Kim Jong-un's time, things have changed. You've got North Korean laborers who've gone to other parts of the world, North Korean diplomats who get out, American NGO workers who've gone into North Korea, and many other Americans. But compare for us, if you would, Kim Il-sung's leadership approach to that of Kim Jong-un. For example, Kim Jong-un seems to be someone who is very willing to take the blame for something or to acknowledge this isn't working. I don't believe that Kim Il-sung necessarily would have done that, but can you, given your research, can you get into some detail here?
Sure, yeah. And of course, I should just make abundantly clear for those who haven't read the book. The book is primarily a work of history. Kim Jong-un doesn't appear until the epilogue. But that said, I do have my thoughts, and I want to make sure that I'm, addressing today, because I think that's really where we are and what we're thinking about. I think for Kim Jong-un, you're right that he has introduced new elements to the family cult of personality. He's done not only with his style that you just talked about. I mean, he's surrounded himself with women, with his wife, his sister, his daughter, in a way that his father and grandfather never did. But also with the repudiation of unification as a goal, as a stated goal of the North Korean state. These are pretty big deviations here. You could almost call them heresies if you want to put it in that religious vocabulary. You're right, it is a different style. I'm not sure if I totally understand what to make of it. It may be that, yes, North Korea is less isolated now. Technology has now meant that there are competing forces that he needs to be responding to. I mean, he himself, by going to Singapore and walking around the Marina Bay Sands and so on, was introducing totally different images to the front page of the Nodong Sinmun and to state media. He is, as we all know, raised for some years in Switzerland. He is a different generation. So there may be some reflection of that. I still would say that in a larger context, he is still, to take the words of one person that I quote here, in many senses, I still believe, the high priest of the cult of his grandfather. The state has changed since Kim Il-sung died in 1994. It's been more than 3 decades. Certainly, we have the internet, we have smartphones, we have all sorts of things that didn't exist in the world anymore. And North Korea has not been able to keep these out entirely. And yet, I suspect that visiting the country today, visiting the country in 1994, of course, it's been more than 3 decades, but in so many ways, the state remains very much the state that his grandfather established. He is still the eternal president, and it's still his statue, it's still his portrait that is still in the primary place. Now, I don't know that that will remain forever. Perhaps it's a third portrait that joins the other two, a third statue that joins the other two, or perhaps there's something different because Kim Jong-un now has been in power for 15 years, and perhaps at some point he will feel confident enough in really putting a stamp on the cult of personality in a different way.
We earlier referenced Kim Il-sung's emphasis on storytelling, mythology, and it's interesting through your book to sort of follow his evolution, a range of ways. My question is, at the end of his life, had Kim Il-sung come to the point of where he actually believed that he was a deity?
It's a great question. I wish I could give you an answer. Obviously, I never had a chance to meet with him, speak with him.
But based upon your research.
Yeah, and even if I had, I'm not sure that I would know. I think certainly there was, and again, in his own memoir, he kind of acknowledges play acting as Messiah. I think I use that phrase in the book. But we all know it's in human nature that when you're put up on a pedestal for a little while, you can start to believe your own hype. And I don't know if that's the case here, but I think the adulation that he had directed at him for as many decades as he did, with no real challengers. I mean, there was a coup attempt in August of 1956. But beyond that, he was almost entirely unchallenged for 49 years. I don't know that for 49 years, if you had surrounded me with a lot of people telling me how great I was, I might start to believe it. There's a big question about who really constructed the personality cult. Kim Jong-il is given a lot of credit, rightly so. He was a film buff, but more importantly, I think he understood the importance of the iconography, of the symbols, of the imagery. And I think he really did help elevate his father's cult and take it kind of to the next level. And yet, at the same time, we can't entirely credit Kim Jong-il with it because we know that the cult of personality around Kim Il-sung was already quite extraordinary by the time Kim Jong-il would have been hitting his early teens, which would be the earliest that you could plausibly credit him with helping build his father's cult. And so, whether it was Kim Jong-il, whether it was Hwang Jang-yap, whether it was whoever you want to say, or Stalin, whoever you may say, played a role in building the cult of personality, Kim Il-sung certainly didn't do anything to stop it. You actually do get these anecdotes where he says, for example, the Grand People's Study House. He actually says, don't name this after me. And so they don't name it after him. It's the Grand People's Study House. But those are the exceptions. And if we know that he has veto power over those naming rights, well, he didn't exercise them all that often because there are many things named for Kim Il-sung in North Korea, many things named for the date that he would have visited a certain place for the first time. And of course, the statues, the portraits, the images, the mosaics, the murals, the everything. He had the power to say no, and he didn't. So did he drink his own Kool-Aid in a certain sense? I don't, I find that probably would be my answer. But I couldn't prove it.
All right. So it's fascinating in terms of the religious history of Korea when you consider that the peninsula has, shamanism, Buddhism, Confucianism. You point out in your book that during the Japanese occupation, the Japanese insisted that Shintoism spread, be promoted throughout the North. And you stated that by 1920, there were nearly 140,000 Shinto shrines throughout Korea. Then after the war, after the occupation, you have well, Christianity as well, which predated the Japanese occupation. But my question is, how or did this wide range of religious experience, I mean, if you're living in Korea and under the Japanese occupation, you had to worship a certain way. Prior to that, you could worship perhaps as a Christian or other ways. To what degree does this wide range of did this wide range of religious experience provide fertile soil for Kim Il-sung and developing his cult of personality?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think it must have played a role. This is, of course, a very there's no right or wrong answer to this question.
Right.
It's the sort of thing that we can only speculate on. But you're right that religion has always been so deeply woven into Korean society. Under the Japanese, it was imposed on them. But Christianity was something that the Korean people, particularly in and around Pyongyang, really embraced with gusto. And I think that did provide some of the framework, some of the foundation, the right environment, surely, for these practices. Now, when the missionaries first get there, it's interesting. They actually think of Korea as an a-religious place, but I think very quickly they come to recognize their folly in that way, that it may not be the way that they had expected it, but there is a deep reservoir of spirituality in Korea. And I do think that, yes, Kim Il-sung was able to tap into that. And I would argue that Christianity played perhaps the biggest role, although you're absolutely right, too, to say shamanism, Confucianism, insofar as we would regard that as a religion or an ideology, surely, state Shintoism, or Japanese emperor worship, however you want to put it, even Stalinism or socialism in its own way has its own rites and its own rituals and its own doctrines and its dogmas as well. And so I think all of these are competing in a certain sense, but they're not necessarily in a zero-sum sort of a setting. I think what happens is you get a sort of syncretism where you have different strands from different ideologies and teachings kind of merging in the stew of the Korean psyche, maybe something like that.
You know, Kim Jong-un appears to be a serious student of history. And when Kim Jong-un first took over, he spent considerable time researching his grandfather's relationship with other leaders, Stalin, for example, at great length, which it's fascinating to consider that. But let's talk about history and the current context for a moment, if we will. And this relates to China and Russia. So in your book, you write, the Sino-Soviet split that began widening in the late 1950s pitted Pyongyang's principal backers against one another, giving Kim Il-sung room to carve out his path of self-reliance. Kim Il-sung skillfully swung from one patron to the other. In July 1961, Kim signed a treaty of friendship and mutual assistance with Moscow, and then another with Beijing the following week, timed to go into effect at the same instant. Compare that to today, Kim Jong-un in China, and Russia.
No, I think Kim Jong-un has been brilliant, and I think he has done exactly what you are highlighting there. He has learned from his grandfather and his father. I think all three of them, father, son, and grandson, have been masters at playing what one might regard as a relatively weak hand. And by a weak hand, I just mean a smaller population than the USSR or the PRC, and certainly geographically smaller, surrounded on all sides by potential adversaries. They've done a brilliant job in their own way of balancing these powers, these neighbors of theirs. And so I think that's something that we are still seeing every day. And so we have Kim Jong-un, of course, sending troops to the war front between Russia and Ukraine. But as Putin and Kim get closer, you see the Chinese sending Wang Yi, the foreign minister, to Pyongyang. What does it all mean? I think we're still we're still guessing. We're still trying to figure it out. But I wouldn't be surprised if the archives later show that what we do have here is precisely what you described there in 1961 that Kim Il-sung did, which was North Korea skillfully playing off its two primary patrons against one another.
It continues.
It continues.
I'd like to, for our audience, I'd like to suggest that if you have questions, use the Q&A function to submit those, and we will get to as many as we can. In your opinion, what is the status of Christianity in North Korea today?
So in North Korea today, I mean, let's start with the most basic.
And I should say, and freedom of religion as a whole.
And freedom of religion, yes. In general, you have to start with that Marxist-Leninist principle or precept or whatever you want to call it, that religion is the opiate of the masses. I think that's the starting point. And of course, North Korea is officially, technically an atheistic state. I think a lot of what I'm trying to show in this book is that it has many of the trappings of what I call a religious society. But North Korea, the DPRK would not acknowledge that. They would deny that. They would disagree vehemently with that characterization. And yet I think that, of course, there is this overlay in almost everything that we see in North Korea. Officially, there are now, of course, churches in Pyongyang. We have two Protestant churches. We have a Catholic cathedral. We have a Russian Orthodox church. I believe that at least for a time there was even a mosque on the grounds of the Iranian embassy, but I'm not entirely sure whether that's still standing. There's probably people in the chat who know better than I do as to the latest status of that. And of course, there are other houses of worship if you want to look at the Pyongyang University of Science and Technology, or if you look at the Kaesong Industrial Complex when it stood, or the Mount Kumgang, or up at the light water reactor that had been set up in Hamgyong province, I'm sorry. All of these had little chapels or churches established by some of the people who were doing work in these various places. But primarily, we're talking about four main houses of worship in the Christian tradition in Pyongyang that are officially recognized and officially open. And the genesis of these churches, I find to be absolutely fascinating. And I get into it towards the end of the book because Kim Il-sung did preside over a state that was not particularly friendly to Christianity for many decades. And certainly in the 1950s and in the 1960s, the state was very active in villainizing especially Christian missionaries, especially American Christian missionaries. And a lot of that, of course, overflowed towards the church more broadly. You see that in Sinchon at the Museum of American Atrocities, but you also just see that in its television programming, in its literature, and all the rest of it. I mean, Han Solya and his jackals and some of the writing that was done in the early 50s was very emblematic of that. But towards the end of Kim Il-sung's life, particularly starting in the 70s and accelerating in the 80s and reaching a peak in the 90s, you see Kim Il-sung re-engage with the faith of his childhood in a way that is just, to me, stunning. You can call it nostalgia. There are some skeptics who would say that it was all a big political ploy. That doesn't ring true to me. There may have been some political advantage, perhaps, that was derived from this. And yet, when you take the whole corpus of what he does during these years with the faith, he invites all these pastors to come and visit him, South Korean pastors, Korean American pastors. Billy Graham, of course, came and preached twice and met with Kim Il-sung twice. He's asking them to say grace when he meets with them. He's showing off his Bible knowledge from his childhood. He is reminiscing about the past. He's singing songs from his youth group days as a young man. Um, there's something powerful emotionally that happens to him towards the end of his life, and much of it is wrapped up around the church. He has a dream that
And his mother.
his mother comes to him, and that is part of the reason why I think that's the main reason he builds what is now called Chilgol Kyoe, the Chilgol Church on the outskirts of Pyongyang, the second Protestant church that's officially built by the North Korean state after Pungsu, the larger one built in 88. Um, Fascinating to see Kim Il-sung re-engage. And of course, his memoir, this is where many people learned for the first time that Kim Il-sung was raised in the church, that he learned to play the organ in church, that he taught Sunday school in church, that he spoke at the YMCA, that he lived in the home of a pastor. All of these details come from his own pen. I don't want to suggest that he necessarily physically wrote the memoir himself, but certainly it was presented to the North Korean people in the first person from their great leader, and ought to be treated with the gravity that that implies. This was serious. This was holy writ in North Korea to have these words of Kim Il-sung published like this. And so that shows you that towards the end of Kim Il-sung's life, there really was this reopening of some of these Christian institutions. In addition to the churches, there was the theological seminary that was reopened as well. But I don't want to overstate it either, because we know that for those who are outside of Pyongyang, for those who aren't allowed or able to attend Pongsu or Chilgo Church, I don't think it's a very friendly environment for the faith. Certainly not for Christianity. I can't speak with as much detail towards Buddhism or Islam or other faiths, but certainly with respect to Christianity. And I've been to both of those churches, and I was able to attend service at Pongsu Church in 2017 when the North Koreans invited the Wall Street Journal to come visit. And when you walk into those churches, they look just like any other church that you might find elsewhere. There are no portraits of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il on the walls, and many of the parishioners, many of the congregants are not wearing the badge pins of the Kims. And the sermon that you'll see and hear aren't sermons about Kim Il-sungism per se. They are Christian sermons. The Bibles that are there, the hymnals that are there, are donated by South Korean Christians, and they have the 66 books of the Bible there. You can flip through them. They're all in Korean, of course. But within the confines of this church, I think that on balance, I think there are real believers that are allowed to attend. Many of them, at least when I was there a decade ago, appeared to have a faith that perhaps predated 1945. But I also don't want to overlook the fact that these are almost certainly very, very tightly restricted houses of worship. I don't think that just anyone can waltz in on a Sunday morning. And certainly you'd have to be in Pyongyang. And if you're taking these two churches, in my mind's eye, if I recall how large they were, we're talking at most a few hundred people that could attend this church every Sunday in a country of 25 million people. So that's a long-winded answer. I think that there is some tolerance for Christianity in the country, and certainly all of the aid workers who have done work there since the 1990s up until COVID. So many of them are faith-based organizations. So many of them don't go very far in terms of trying to hide the Christian motivations that animate the work that they do. So there is some tolerance, but I don't want to overstate it either. This is not a place where freedom of religion flourishes.
Yes, I also had opportunity to attend the Bongsu Church on one of my trips related to Senator Lugar. That followed a rather active discussion at the Foreign Ministry about freedom of religion. And during that discussion, one of the officials, when I said, is there freedom of religion in your country? Yes, but the people in my country know that God has abandoned them because God allowed your government to bomb all of the churches and to bomb our country. Fascinating exchange back and forth. And my experience at the church, very similar to yours. Mark Tokala, who is in our audience, asked, did the Soviets pick Kim Il-sung out of obscurity and install him, or could he have assumed power on his own?
That's a great question. I do get into it, and many other scholars have tackled this question as well. I think my takeaway from it is that he was a member of the Red Army. He was somebody who was known to the Soviet leadership. They did need somebody indigenously to be their man in Pyongyang. And actually, he wasn't their first choice. Their first choice was a man named Cho Man-sik, who was a conservative Christian elder. But that relationship did not last all that long. Cho Man-sik was a genuinely popular politician, if you want to call him that, or political figure. But Kim Il-sung, in many ways, was the one who was better aligned with the Soviets' political goals. He was not the only one that could have fit this. And ultimately, I don't know that we know for sure why Stalin wanted Kim Il-sung in particular. I don't know that they had that close of a relationship, but certainly his attributes made him attractive. So I don't think he could have become the leader of Northern Korea at the time, North Korea after 1948, without the backing of Stalin and of the Soviet Union. But the idea that he was plucked out of obscurity is there's definitely something to it. But he was decently well positioned. He played his cards very well, and he was a genuinely charismatic man. I think everyone who's met him, everyone who's dealt with him would affirm that, and I think that may have played a role as well. And I think, though this may not have been known to Stalin or to Moscow, Kim Il-sung's roots, having grown up in this Jerusalem of the East, made him in some ways an ideal person to deal with some of the opposition that he faced in those early years, being as he was in the capital of the conservative Christian north of Korea. I don't know that this was fully appreciated in Moscow, but again, the fact that Cho Man-sik, a conservative Christian church elder, was their first choice because of his popularity there, hints at some of the challenges that Kim Il-sung faced domestically when he was trying to establish himself in Pyongyang after the war.
So Hall Healy asks a fascinating question. He writes, you mentioned that the books of the Bible in Pyongyang were in Korean. Were they in South Korean or were they translated into North Korean dialect?
Thanks, Hall. I don't recall. First of all, this was 2017 when I was there. I didn't take a copy with me, but I do recall, even through 9 years of trying to think back, I'm almost certain that those Bibles were donated by the South Korean Presbyterian Church. I don't remember exactly which. The Presbyterians are not a united group in the South. I don't remember which South Korean Presbyterian group, but it was donated by them, and I would presume, therefore, that it was a South Korean version of the Bible, but I can't say that with full certainty. There may be, again, people on this call who know better than I do.
So Hall's question leads to another point, and that is the differences between South Korean and North Korean. And as it relates to interpreters that are used, for example, by the US government when we have talks with North Korea,
Yes.
To what degree do the American interpreters know the North Korea nuanced details of the language? Is this important?
It's been now more than 80 years since the peninsula was divided. The North Koreans were fastidious about ensuring that foreign derived words didn't make their way into North Korean vocabulary. you saw in South Korea that Chinese characters or Sinitic characters, Hanza, Hanmun, would still be used in quite widely in public life in South Korea, certainly through the 60s and the 70s. And of course, even today, if you look at Yonhap or you look at the Chosun Ilbo, you will find the Chinese characters are still there. You won't find that at all in North Korea. And that was almost from the very beginning. So there was the linguistic choices that were made were quite deliberate on the part of Kim Il-sung, or certainly his government. And so, yes, of course, there has been a divergence. I think there always, I think that would be only natural to expect. Certainly, you think about British English or American English or Scottish English or Australian English. These things evolve on their own. How important it is a good question. I think because of the political tinge of having South Korean incorporating so much English, so much Americanisms, if you want to call them that, into the language. I think insofar as that was translated in the South Korean translation that sits there on the pews in Pongsu Church in North Korea, I could see that being pretty jarring for a North Korean reader. But I don't know that a Bible translation necessarily would have incorporated too many Americanisms. Obviously, the original text was written in Greek or Aramaic or in other ancient languages that then would have had to have been translated. But this is where I probably need to defer to the experts. But I simply I don't know. But it does speak to, yes, the considerable gap that has emerged between North and South Korea over the 8 decades.
So, reflecting upon your experience as a journalist for many years, whether you're in South Korea or China, have you noticed situations where it appears to you that key messages or key interactions between the United States and North Korea have been lost in translation?
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. I wish I could think of an example off the top of my head. I can't, not right now. But yes, I mean, the language of diplomacy is so precise, it's so careful. Um, in my work on China now, yes, you have this question right now of whether or not the US government is going to, in the context of Taiwan, this is not a Korean Peninsula issue now, is going to not support Taiwanese independence or whether it's going to oppose Taiwanese independence. And these sorts of nuances, they do seem academic at some level, and they are quite nuanced, and yet these things matter in diplomacy. I don't see that talks between the US and North Korea, and they haven't happened for some years, how they wouldn't somehow have some of the message be lost in translation. So I think that's a danger, yes.
So one of our attendees states the South Korean intelligence service has identified Kim Jong-un's daughter as his most likely successor. Do you believe this to be possible given the ideology underpinning of the Kim dynasty and its male leadership in the past?
Well, I think that Kim Jong-un's daughter, we think her name is Kim Ju-ae, but now there's new levels of doubt about whether or not that really is her name or not. We're not entirely sure about her age. I can say it sure looks to me like she is being positioned as a potential successor. But you also have to keep in mind that Kim Jong-un is still just in his early 40s and theoretically could be in control for 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. Who's to say? Certainly, I don't know how long he will live. And I don't know that he would hand over power before that. Those are all questions that none of us can really answer. But it sure does look like she is perhaps being positioned to be a successor. Now, if indeed Kim Jong-un does live for many more decades, that does give her quite a bit of runway to learn, but also to have the notion of a daughter, not a son, succeed, to be socialized within North Korean society. I mean, you can look at US society, American society, the notion of a female president, I don't think is far-fetched at all. It hasn't happened yet, but I don't think that anybody would say on the face of it that it's not a possibility. And that's because we've had we've had that idea acculturated now. But certainly 20, 30, 40 years ago, it was indeed a very far-fetched notion. So I know American society, North Korean society, these are two very different societies, and yet I think the human capacity to adapt and uh, to adapt to a new reality. Certainly, Kim Jong-un, when he took power, was not even 30 years old, barely 30 years old. I mean, Kim Il-sung was 33, so I suppose you could say that there was a precedent for that. But still, there were so many ways in which Kim Jong-un broke the mold. And if anyone were to break the mold with his own succession, it would be Kim Jong-un himself, perhaps.
So as we earlier discussed, North Korea is different today than it was during the time of Kim Il-sung.
Yes.
North Korea today, there is more openness, cell phones being used, traders going in and out. We've already talked about the laborers in North Korea going out. North Koreans are now able to be trained to learn about how to make money and how to start a business, which leads to the next question from one of our attendees. And how has the Kim Il-sung cult been transferred to Kim Jong-un? Perhaps the level of adoration or not. How would you break this down?
Yeah, well, obviously the transmission channel, of course, would be through the man in the middle there, Kim Jong-il. Didn't go straight from grandson to son, or son, grandfather to grandson. But I think maybe what I'll do is I'll start by going back to 1994. Keep in mind the context here. The Berlin Wall has fallen. The USSR has just collapsed, and Kim Il-sung has just died in 1994. He has run this country for 49 years. There was no one else almost in recent memory that they could imagine other than Kim Il-sung at the helm. Of course, this famine was sweeping the country. I don't know that too many people thought that Kim Jong-il would really be able to take the reins. Certainly, Kim Jong-il lacked the natural charisma that his father possessed. And Kim Jong-il, we all recall from that period, was the object of a lot of ridicule and a lot of underestimation. And this idea that I cited earlier, and I included in my book, I can't remember off the top of my head which scholar writes this, but brings this idea that Kim Jong-il will not be able to replace his father at the head of the family cult. He will merely serve as perhaps the high priest of his father's cult. And I think that was a really nice way to put it. Certainly, in sticking with the religious theme of the book that I've written is nice there. But it was only in time that Kim Jong-il was gradually able to bring himself up to the level where his portrait could be placed next to his father's, where his statue could be placed next to his father's. And Kim Jong-un notably has not done either of those things yet, to the point where we can see perhaps a third portrait on the wall or a third statue on Mansudae in Pyongyang. And I think Kim Jong-un did a very similar thing with Kim Jong-il as well. Also put Kim Jong-il into sort of an emeritus role, an eternal title to go along with Kim Il-sung's eternal president title, but also served, in other words, as something of a high priest of his father and grandfather's cults. In many ways, he preserved so much of it. We've talked already a little bit about how he's deviated from it, but I think those should be treated as more of the exception to the rule. You think about how in those early days, how much he styled himself in the same way as Kim Il-sung. And we know that this was a conscious decision, not only because of how uncannily he resembles his grandfather, but also because some of the early hagiographies written of Kim Jong-un are precisely remarking on the similarity between his smile and Kim Il-sung's smile. I believe even his gait and all the rest of it. I don't think that was a mistake. Kim Il-sung, I think, to this day, is still regarded by many North Koreans as the best of the lot, as it were. Certainly Kim Jong-il, I think in part because of the period that he was the leader, the most difficult decade in recent North Korean memory, means that the fondness for Kim Il-sung remains. And and so Kim Il-sung does harken back to a time when North Korea can say, look, we were strong to a degree. They were ahead of the South Korean economy by many measures. And so there was a lot for Kim Il-sung to be, there's a lot of reason for Kim Jong-un to want to tap into the good feelings around Kim Il-sung.
Jonathan, we're really pleased today to also hear from William Brown, who has his own familial connections to the peninsula. Bill writes, Presbyterian beliefs are closely linked to individual responsibility and confession without a bishop or pope intervention. And Kim Jong-un in Switzerland might have encountered the same. But this seems quite in opposition to authoritarianism of socialism, the theology of the North Korean state. Do you find Kim Il-sung had leanings toward individual capitalist-style economics, or does Kim Jong-un?
It's a great question, and thanks, Bill, for that question. I don't know that I saw that in Kim Il-sung's life. He was, of course, a self-identified socialist, and a lot of the 5-year plans, 7-year plans, and so on that he enacted were, of course, done in the Soviet mold. So much of what he did economically was in that socialist mold. Um, Kim Jong-un, I think there was a lot of hope that he would experiment with more Western-style capitalistic reforms. I don't know that we've seen those hopes live up to the expectations of many people who watch North Korea, but I'll let others be the judge of that. Um, but yes, this notion that Presbyterian beliefs and how they filtered through, I don't think have necessarily manifested themselves in economic policy, but we certainly see them in a lot of the ritual that surrounds the cult of Kim Il-sungism, as I would describe it. And they found other ways, but I'm not sure the economy is where I would necessarily see that.
So, Jonathan, as you were conducting your research, what is the oh my moment that you recall the most? A surprise, something you did not expect.
Oh boy. I mean, there were so many. I think I mentioned one already, and that would have been this late in life re-embrace, if you want to call it that, or re-engagement. So or I think perhaps re-engagement is the better word with the faith of his childhood. I think that to me, it upended a lot of notions that I had about North Korea and religion. Again, I don't think that the leader of North Korea at the end of his life, perhaps growing nostalgic about his childhood and his upbringing in the church, necessarily negates what he did before in terms of the policies towards Christianity and the stifling and the crushing of the Christian faith. And yet, it does complicate one's understanding because in a country where the rule was as personalist as it was and is in North Korea, that Christianity should have been so deeply embedded into the formative years of Kim Il-sung's life and find expression again towards the end, I thought was absolutely it was moving in its own way too. Although it doesn't absolve him of what was done in the middle. So that would be one answer. I think the other answer, and I haven't mentioned this yet, is the relationship that Kim Il-sung had both with, indirectly, with Jim Jones of Jonestown and with the Reverend Moon of the Unification Church. And that was a direct personal relationship that the two men had. But to me, those three men represent different strands, I think, with a similar root. I think all three of those men understood at heart the human need to believe in someone, to believe in something. And in many ways, in the ability, in the power of faith, to 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 get what you want in a certain way. And it was fascinating to see the depth of that relationship or the ties. Let's not call it a relationship between Jim Jones and Kim Il Sung, the way that Jim Jones adopted three Korean children, um, propagated Kim Il Sung's teachings in his sermons at Jonestown, the way that the ship met regularly with North Korean diplomats in Guyana, and the way that Jim Jones ultimately looked to North Korea as a potential place to relocate his settlement. There was a lot of mutual admiration and almost mutual understanding between those two groups. And with the Unification Church as well, the Reverend Moon and his um, run-ins with Kim Il Sung. I mean, the two of them were born and raised in extraordinarily similar circumstances, both of them in northwestern Korea, within 8 years of one another, in Presbyterian households. The difference being that by the time the Reverend Moon was proclaiming himself to be a messianic figure in Pyongyang in 1945, Kim Il Sung was already in charge and served as a political messiah figure for the Korean nation, in his conception, in his retelling. And the two men, of course, came to loggerheads because they fell on opposite sides of the ideological divide, with the Reverend Moon becoming quite anti-communist, and anti-North Korea. But of course, at the end of their lives, we see the two of them embrace in Pyongyang. We see that
After Kim Il Sung had Reverend Moon imprisoned, right?
that's right, after he had him imprisoned twice. And and we see the two men embrace. We see the two men start an automotive joint venture together, Pyeonghwa Motors. And then we see Kim Il Sung allow the Reverend Moon to turn his birthplace in northwestern Korea into a pilgrimage site for Unification Church members. Again, there was a mutual recognition here of the power of faith, and that if you want people, if you want to cultivate loyalty, even devotion in your supporters, in your followers, um, religion, faith, there's no better way to do it. There's no better way to command loyalty and devotion than through the vocabulary, the language, the iconography of faith.
So Jonathan, before I turn to you for any final comments, I would just like to share something that you're already familiar with, in that a number of NCNK members have long ties to North Korea, whether that be Heidi Linton, the Linton family. Yes. Samaritan's Purse, David Phillips, one of our members, is with Samaritan's Purse, which, as you know, has continued to be active in North Korea after Bill Graham was there.
Yes.
The Quakers, American Friends Service Committee,
Yes,
active in North Korea, going back, I believe, to 1980. And so what often is not known in the United States is that American humanitarian workers have had contact with thousands of North Koreans at the local level throughout these years. And up until COVID, up until Hanoi, Kim Jong-un was open to not just a matter of pushing back on NGOs, but the international element as a whole. That's beginning to change as North Korea is now reaching out to NGOs that are American and others. It's beginning to change. Well, President Trump, as you know, would like to connect with Kim Jong-un. We are hopeful that the State Department and the Treasury Department will proceed to allow U.S. NGOs to actually go ahead and apply for their passports, their licenses. And I think that process is coming along. So in reading the book, I was just reminded about the number of connections historically and currently to NCNK and to many others in the U.S. So final comments?
Yeah, as I researched, wrote this book over these past 12 years, I think one of the things that most struck me and that most motivated me, kept me going and all this, is just this notion in America. I think when most Americans turn on the TV or go on YouTube or wherever they get their news from and see these images of Kim Jong-un or Kim Jong-il or Kim Il-sung standing on that rostrum at Kim Il-sung Square and you see the ICBMs or the goose-stepping soldiers go by, I think so many Americans think that is the most alien, the most other, the most foreign, the most strangest place. It's the antithesis of who we are. And what really motivated me was understanding how actually this faith, this ideology, these teachings that Kim Il-sung, the state founder, was so steeped in growing up, had its roots in postbellum American Presbyterianism. It, in many ways, ought to be familiar to Americans. I'm not saying that what we see in North Korea is a quasi-Christian state or a pseudo-Christian state or a crypto-Christian state. That's not it at all. And yet we have to understand that through this person of Kim Il-sung, that's the pivot point between the embrace that Pyongyang had for Christianity and the state that we see today. In him, he processed a lot of these teachings that came through American missionaries, channeled them through his own person and through his own experiences in his own time. And what came out the other side was something that was very different and yet had these roots. And that's the word I use here in the subtitle. The roots are there. And I don't want to say it's the only thing, but insofar as we think of North Korea as being this great, terrible other, I think there's commonality. There might be responsibility to a certain degree in what America had brought to the Korean Peninsula starting in the 1880s and how it evolved there.
Very good. Well, again, this is the book, Korean Messiah. I do encourage you to get a copy, to read it, especially if you're going to be involved in matters related to the DPRK. I'd like to thank my colleagues, Marissa McPherson and Seth Joyner, for their assistance today. And Jonathan, thanks again, but we don't want to wait another 9 years to have you back, all right?
Anytime.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us.